Disabled characters in movies used to be horrific people, Quasimodos and the Captain Hooks and all of the villainous people who were so angered by their disability that they had to get back at society.
There's the sexually deviant version of little people that is very prevalent.
Let's take an able-bodied person and help a disabled person. Always. It's like, oh, the poor disabled guy. Well, why?
There's been, the occasional moment where a director might say, I want you to, jump up on the table here. And I just say, there's no real moment in my life where I would do that. So I just feel like that's some sort of stereotypical idea of little people needing to gain power through height.
Then there's a whole class of films where the person is a sad person in a wheelchair, or blind. Their life means nothing if they're blind.
What happened in the past probably you wouldn't be able to get away with it today. You just could not get away with it with actors out there who are disabled. They just wouldn't let it happen. They wouldn't let people play victims. They wouldn't let the things that happened back then happen today.
Whether someone becomes a wheelchair user, whether someone is blind, someone is deaf, or if they have an intellectual or psychiatric disability, is that somehow disability means inability. That the fact that you have some sort of impairment means that you are not able to do anything. It's very obvious that's not the case, but Hollywood hasn't always gotten the message.
In the globalization of media through the internet, we're seeing not only truthful depictions of actors with disability, but truthful depictions of people with disability. We can't get away with some of the old mythologies and the old stereotypes because there's activist groups out there that are going to point the finger and go, no, that's not right. I mean, look at all of us. You can't play this game anymore.
The Projected Image, A History of Disability in Film. Tuesdays in October, beginning at 8 p.m. For a complete schedule and exclusive content, visit tcm.com/DIF.
Why is it important to you? Why is it important to everybody that we do this festival?
Well, perception of disability has changed throughout time. From the time of the silence, from even the first film, one of the first films Thomas Edison did, The Fake Beggar, up through now in 2012, has certainly changed. There have been trends from the silent era going through the different wars that we've had, the social changes in society, our attitudes about physical disability, mental disability have all changed. Those have been reflected in the films that we show, in the films that we see, and they've both informed what happens in society and informed those notions about society. So in order to understand where we are, we have to understand where we've been.
I'm Ben Mankiewicz. I'm back with my co-host Lawrence CarterLong, who's been joining me every Tuesday this October to examine movies that feature characters living with disabilities. Lawrence, what are you hoping this festival will accomplish?
I'm hoping with this festival that we can put the films that have been made about folks with disabilities into a greater historical context, into a greater cultural context. There's a maxim in the disability community that says nothing about us without us. Often those decisions have been made by other people, be they politicians, be they doctors, be they social workers. What we're seeing now is a trend away from all of that where disabled people are taking control of their own lives. That includes the media that we see. That also includes understanding the history, where we've been, where we are right now, and where we should be going. Cinema is a big part of that.
Cinema, a big part of putting these movies in some sort of historical context. You look at this at Mandy from 1952 and get a real sense of what it was like then to raise a deaf child.
Yeah, exactly. What it was like then, what were the images that people were seeing, what were the stories that people were being told? If you had no contact, outside contact with, let's say, another family that had a child that was deaf, where did you get your information? You couldn't go to the internet. Unless you were in a bigger city, you probably couldn't find some sort of support group or a hospital. So the information you got was largely informed by the movies that you saw, right? By the stories you were told. And if these were the types of stories you were told, these were the options that you felt were available to you.
Must be really helpful for families with kids with a disability just to be able to talk to not just one other family, but dozens of other families, and one, to learn that their problems are everyone's problems, and then come up with other ways to cope that maybe they hadn't thought of.
Exactly, and especially, not only the families of folks with disabilities. I mean, you're right, you don't have to be the person with the disability to have disability affect you. If you have a child born with autism or Down syndrome, That affects everyone. It also affects you if your mother's hip goes out, right? Or your cousin comes back from Iraq or Afghanistan missing a limb or with traumatic brain injury. Also, unlike any other minority, disability is the only minority you can join in an instant. Superman falls off the horse, boom, you're in the club. There's no disability 101. There's no place you can go to learn how to readapt not only to the environment that you've taken for granted, but the body that you now inhabit. And so the stories that we tell are crucially important in informing people on the lives that they can live, the social situation around them, the expectations that they have, not only from the society, but for themselves.
Every conversation we have, Lawrence, you get just a little bit smarter. Thanks very much. Hi, I'm Ben Mankiewicz. Thanks for joining me as we begin this year's retrospective of films that examine how specific segments of the population have been portrayed in film over the years. This year, we're going to focus on people living with a disability. We're calling the series The Projected Image, A History of Disability in Film. My guest joining me every Tuesday throughout October is an expert on the subject, Lawrence CarterLong. Lawrence is a film consultant for Inclusion in the Arts, a nonprofit organization that works to increase employment opportunities for minorities in the arts. Lawrence is also a public affairs specialist for the National Council on Disability. Lawrence, welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having us, Ben.
Lawrence programmed our lineup of films, and we begin with a popular classic from 1957, An Affair to Remember. Obviously, we have a disability, a person with a disability in this film, Deborah Carr. In historical context, how does this film handle that issue?
Well, we called this series a projected image because often in cinema, the hopes and fears that viewers would have about disability, you could see in the characters on screen. The disability doesn't come through until the third act in An Affair to Remember, and it's one of those questions that is never answered throughout the course of the film. Why doesn't she tell him? What are her fears? What is she afraid to let him know? Why did this time go by? Why did they almost miss their opportunity? And there are a lot of speculation about that, but we can assume, given the context, that it was because of shame, right? That she wasn't the person that she was when she met him.
She didn't feel whole.
She didn't feel whole, she didn't feel complete, and she felt probably feared that she would be rejected. That's very reflective of the times.
The next movie we have coming up, I know, is a movie that you have a keen interest in, and it's not available on DVD, so this is a rare opportunity for people to see it.
Yeah, it's one of those films that I was delighted to be able to bring to TCM and to the festival. It's really shows you what Hollywood can do if it wants to. It was brought to me by a filmmaker, a woman named Jenny Gold, who's doing a documentary on this issue called Cinemability. It's an actress named Susan Peters, who had worked with Lionel Barrymore earlier in her career and was a shining star, was sort of rising, if you will, who became paralyzed through a gunshot accident. The studio didn't give up on her, though. They liked this actress so much that they said, we're going to develop this vehicle for her. The film is called Sine of the Ram. Think about Joan Crawford on wheels, if you will. She manipulates her family. She manipulates her surroundings. She's as angry and as vile, I think, as any character that you could see, but she owns that role. And it's something that it's a bravura performance, a movie that deserves its due and deserves to be seen by a larger audience.
All right, Lawrence, thanks very much. Lawrence and I are actually done for the night, but we're going to be back together next Tuesday to talk about how disabled people have been portrayed in films over the years. For now, stick around, because up next, the film that Lawrence and I have been talking about, The Sign of the Ram from 1948, and director John Sturges with Susan Peters. Next in our lineup is a film based on the early life of Helen Keller. It's from 1962, Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke in The Miracle Worker. Obviously, Lawrence, if you're going to do this series of films on people with disabilities, you can't not include The Miracle Worker.
No, there's no way. In terms of sort of American icons with disabilities, I think you probably, the two that you have to include when having that conversation are FDR and Helen Keller. And since we're talking about cinema, you can't get away from I think, this story on the life of Helen Keller, because she was such a cultural icon. She was such a part of the fabric of American life that her story is beloved, has been beloved since she wrote it, and continues to be.
Because of Helen Keller's life, after the limited part most Americans know from what they see in The Miracle Worker, but the whole span of her life, because of her remarkable work helping start the American Civil Liberties Union, her activism. I feel like Helen Keller really one of the most underrated people of the 20th century. I feel like not enough people know her story, her full, complete story.
I think sadly, most Americans, if they know anything at all, they know about what happened at the water pump. You know,
Right.
it sort of ends with Wawa, and people don't know, at least at this day and age, where her life went after that point. And I think it's after that point is just as fascinating, if not more so, than everything that came before. You know, once she found language, once she found a way to communicate, she never stopped. She was an activist, you know, she traveled the world doing lectures and meeting people sort of as an ambassador, if you will. Brought Akita dogs to this country from Japan.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, helped start the ACLU, was actually on the FBI's watch list because of her political activities.
Who wasn't?
And indeed, you know, it was the 40s and the 50s, but she never backed down, you know, from a fight. And I think it's those fights as she developed her political will and I think her social conscience that deserves greater examination.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ben Mankiewicz. All month long, Tuesday nights, we've been examining how people living with a disability have been represented on film. Back with me once again is Lawrence CarterLong, the film consultant for the nonprofit organization Inclusion in the Arts. He's also the public affairs specialist for the National Council on Disability. Lawrence, welcome back.
Pleasure to be here as always.
Our next film is from 1975. It was the first movie in more than 40 years to win Oscars for Best Picture, Best Actor, and Best Actress. It's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Lawrence, it seems clear why you would have chosen a movie like this, but I want you to tell me why you thought it was important to include.
I think this film is unique for many reasons, but for our purposes tonight, I think it's particularly unique because it asks the question, who's crazy? And why are they crazy? And how does one get ascribed that label? How does one get that label pinned on them? You know, is it because you step outside what the societal norms are? Is it because you don't do what the majority think you should do? Is it because you don't follow the rules? And if you don't follow the rules, what happens to you, right? They call you crazy, they put you in the institution, your rights go into mothballs. You don't make your decisions for yourself anymore. Somebody else makes those decisions for you. And I think the overarching humanness of the characters within the film, sort of the trajectory that they go through, certainly Nicholson's character, who, you know, as you learn at the beginning of the film, isn't crazy, if you will, in the way that...
Right, under any standard of crazy.
Under any standard of crazy. And yet being in the institution changes sort of his character and takes him in an evolution where you start to wonder where we come up with these assumptions. How do we decide who's crazy? How do we decide who's not? And is it actually the system that's crazy and the system that's in need of reform?
Our next film is a controversial one. It always has been. It's from director Todd Browning in 1932, Freaks. First question, easiest question, why did you program Freaks for this series of movies?
Well, the trend these days is away from hiring non-disabled actors to play disabled characters, but to having disabled people play characters themselves that might happen to be disabled. I think one of the first times that anybody anywhere saw that happen was in Freaks.
Yeah.
You know, it was done in such a way that was unique for that time, is unique for this time. Certainly, you know, the film has a lot of mythology around it, you know, and it does some things that you don't normally see in the pantheon of all cinema. You know, normally we're taught to identify, we're expected to identify and empathize with the non-disabled character who's there sort of helping the disabled character find a leg up, find a way forward. With this film, it flips the script. You know, the non-disabled character, sort of the blonde, the buxom, is the villain, and it's the freaks that you identify with. It's the freaks that you empathize with. You know, very early on, you're on their side. And I think if you look at just the plot of this story, it's a good old-fashioned melodrama. I wouldn't even frame it as a horror film, but because that aspect of the film is so unsettling, I think, psychologically for the audience, where they find themselves identifying with these freaks and they don't quite know what to do with that emotion, it gains a greater resonance.